Understanding Money and Inflation. Part 2. Where does money come from? Don't hesitate to stop the program at any time and discuss what you have learned about money creation. You will find some statements upon which you and eminent economists will agree, and others where you will disagree. The important thing is for you to understand where money comes from and where it goes. Who knows? You may be an economic advisor to a president someday. Meanwhile, let's consider the question, where does money come from? Not many high school and college students know where money comes from. Do you? The person who does not understand the simple process of modern-day money creation by commercial banks will never understand how the nation's business system grows and functions. The term bank is supposedly derived from banco, the Italian word for bench. The Lombard Jews of Italy had benches in the marketplace where they changed coins and bills. When a banker failed, his bench was broken by the people and he was called a bankrupt. Banks originally dealt in money in the form of coins and bills, but now they deal primarily in credit. Money in the form of coins and bills is almost incidental to the huge volume of business of the modern banking system in the United States. Bank deposits are as old as banking, but the practice of transferring the title to these deposits by check is a fairly recent development. A firm in London printed the first check forms in 1722. In many countries, even today, most business is conducted with coins and bills, and very little by check. We all use this money tool, but with rare exceptions, our education in school is limited to a few experiences in buying and in figuring change. The student is told to work hard, save his money, and be careful about what he buys. Good sound advice, but not very enlightening if one is to understand the barrage of economic news from television, radio, and newspapers. If you asked 100 people if they think it would be a good thing if everyone were out of debt, most would answer yes. Yet, if everyone, including the United States government, were out of debt, there would be no government bonds, no savings and loan associations, no credit unions, no charge accounts, no credit cards, no interest income, no banks, in fact, no money. Almost all money in circulation in the United States depends upon someone else's being in debt to the commercial banks. No longer do kings stamp gold and silver into coins or inflate them by clipping the edges and making new coins from the clippings. Have you noticed that our coins are still serrated on the edges, even though they are now made out of a cheap alloy? In America, banks no longer print their own bills, as they were permitted to do many years ago. Modern-day money in the United States depends on the creation of debt through commercial banks. The basic process of money creation is simplicity itself, even though a detailed explanation becomes complicated. Briefly, this is what happens. The banker has the borrower sign a note, and the amount of the note is credited to his checking account. The banker has created a new loan and a new deposit. Two entries are made on the balance sheets of the bank without disturbing any other person's money on deposit. No other institution is authorized to do this. To illustrate how new money is created, let us start with the formation of a new commercial bank. A group of citizens starts the new bank with $500,000 of their own money. The bank statement shows $500,000 in assets and $500,000 in liabilities. This is a simplified illustration of the balance sheet of a bank. Banks are required by law to publish a complete financial statement at least once a year. Your local banker can provide you with one or more for classroom use. The new bank must have a building, vault, furniture, and equipment. The bank statement now shows how the new bank spent part of the capital stock, but the balance remains the same, with $500,000 in assets and $500,000 in liabilities. Both sides of the bank statement must remain in balance. The bank opens for business. Let us assume people make deposits of $100,000. The same figures show up on the balance sheet under assets and liabilities. The assets and liabilities have now been increased to $600,000. The demand deposits are checking accounts that the depositors can spend. So far, we are dealing with money already in existence. Let us further assume that the new bank makes a series of loans totaling $50,000. The borrowers place the new loans on deposit so that they can write checks to pay their bills. The bank now has $650,000 in assets and $650,000 in liabilities. This, in its simplest terms, is how the commercial banks create new money. The original depositors have their $100,000 to spend, and the new borrowers, now depositors, with loans of $50,000 have theirs to spend. The bank did not lend any of the $100,000 already on deposit. It created new deposits with a simple bookkeeping entry. This explains how the federal government can inflate the money supply without resorting directly to the printing press. It creates new money by borrowing from the nation's commercial banking system. Remember, the government doesn't start the printing presses when it fails to collect enough in taxes to pay its bills. It gets the extra money it needs by borrowing primarily from commercial banks. It is impossible to answer all of the if questions concerning money creation that will arise in a class of wide-awake students. A complete discussion of this process can be found in most college-level economics textbooks. A few high school textbooks treat the subject in detail. It will help your understanding and answer many of your questions to view the entire banking system of the United States as being one huge bank, with each individual bank being a part of this vast system, so that money taken out of one bank shows up as deposits in another. Individual banks within the system are limited in the amount of new money they can create by the size of their reserve requirements. But for the banking system as a whole, there is no limit. For the commercial banking system in the United States as a whole, new loans and investments create new deposits, which make it possible to create more new money through more new loans, thus creating more new deposits, which make it possible to make more new loans, and thus more new deposits, and so on for trillions and trillions of dollars. Thus, the only limit to the creation of new money is the willingness of the people and/or government to go further and further into debt. Bills and coins get into circulation through the normal operations of the banking system. The actual printing of the bills is done by the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. Coins are produced by the government mints. Perhaps the most difficult fact for one to understand is that the money created by commercial banks disappears when the loans are repaid. The borrowers write checks against their accounts for $50,000 in payment of the loans. The borrowers' deposits for $50,000 no longer exist. Both liabilities and assets automatically drop by $50,000. The money which came into existence as a bookkeeping entry disappears as a bookkeeping entry. It disappears in exactly the reverse of the process by which it was created. All of us, including the government, constantly expand and contract the money supply when we borrow from and repay loans to the commercial banks. This expansion and contraction is absolutely essential in a dynamic economy. If I lend you money, it is obvious I cannot spend it, and thus the money supply is not increased. When it is paid back, it does not disappear as in the case of the commercial bank loans. If a credit union or a savings bank lends you money that others have saved, it is obvious the savers cannot spend it. These institutions cannot increase the money supply. They only act as a means of recirculating money already in existence. Money is voluntarily taken from one person's pocket and loaned to another to spend. No new money is created when the loan is made, and no money is destroyed when the loan is repaid. New banking regulations have narrowed the distinction between savings institutions and commercial banks, but all checks must be cleared through the Federal Reserve System. If a savings bank is temporarily short of funds, it may borrow from a commercial bank and thus, in a roundabout way, create new money. If you put your savings into government bonds, it is obvious that you cannot spend the same money, and thus the money supply is not increased. When the government cannot get enough people to buy government bonds, it turns to the commercial banks for loans, and thus new money is created, and the total money supply increases. There have been times in our history when the government printed or coined money without resorting to the borrowing technique of selling bonds to commercial banks. The famous greenbacks and the free coinage of silver and gold in the 1800s are examples. This may or may not be a good way to create new money. What do you think? Today our government borrows just as you and I borrow, either from individual citizens, loan associations, or commercial banks. When the government borrows from you and me and savings institutions, the money supply is not increased. In this case, interest is paid by the government to the people who have saved their money for future use. When the government borrows from commercial banks or the Federal Reserve, new deposits are created and the money supply is increased. In this case, interest is not paid to savers, but to the commercial banks that created the money. We need to remember this very important difference in the source of borrowed government funds. In other words, the government, by borrowing from the commercial banks of the nation, can create unlimited amounts of money, and therein lies the basic cause of inflation. When you borrow from the commercial bank for any reason, let's say for a new house, the amount of money in circulation increases by the amount of the loan. As you pay off this loan over a period of years, the money supply is gradually contracted by the amount of the payment each month. So in the long run, a commercial bank's loans to individuals, whether for a long or short term, must be repaid and thus do not permanently add to the money supply. The interest which individual borrowers pay to a commercial bank becomes part of the bank's profits. The same is true of most business loans from a commercial bank. When a business borrows from a commercial bank, it must repay the loan sooner or later unless it goes bankrupt. In the case of bankruptcy, the profits of the bank liquidate the loan, and so the money still disappears from circulation. Credit cards add to the amount of money in circulation because credit cards are issued by commercial banks. When you use your credit card, a new loan is automatically made. As soon as you pay your credit card bill, which must eventually happen, the credit card loan is canceled, and so credit cards also add to the money supply, only temporarily. Not so with the federal government. The government can borrow without ever facing the need to repay. It can refinance the loan forever and ever. This is why the debt limit of the government must be raised at regular intervals until in the spring of 1987 the United States government debt was over $2 trillion, a doubling in only 6 years. Government loans tend to become permanent loans, and thus the basic money supply is permanently increased. Money creation is essential in a viable economic system, but it may have dangerous consequences if used by the government as a substitute for adequate and equitable taxation. It is very important that the money supply should grow to keep up with increased production and increased population. Since only the government can go continuously into debt, thus creating a permanent supply of new money, the idea of a balanced federal budget is pure hogwash, and a great many economists agree that this is true. A constitutional amendment requiring a perfectly balanced budget would destroy the government's power to increase the money supply to take care of increased production and/or increased population. Thus, a balanced budget, if strictly enforced by constitutional amendment, would probably cause more problems than it would solve. During the Christmas holidays, extra money is needed to carry on the increased buying and selling of this busy season. The ability of the commercial banks to create new money for its customers at this time is absolutely essential in a dynamic economy. When the Christmas season is over, the money supply is again reduced as the merchants send out bills and the customers repay the money they borrowed. A temporary increase in the money supply is also needed in food production. A farmer may need extra money to buy seed and fertilizer for a crop. When the crop is harvested and sold, he repays the loan. This function of the commercial bank in financing production is absolutely essential to businesses of all kinds. When the money supply and production grow together in balance, the nation usually prospers. A problem occurs when, as a nation, we increase the money supply permanently without increasing the quantity of goods and services. Increased money without increased production causes prices to rise. When this happens, we say we have inflation. So what's the big fuss about inflation? Why do people fear it so much? The answer is that many citizens, especially those on fixed incomes, suffer from rapidly rising prices because the buying power of their money declines. Another kind of problem can occur when money growth is too slow. Then we usually suffer a recession or even a depression. People stop borrowing because they are afraid, and thus the money supply shrinks even further, making the recession feed upon itself. When money growth is too fast, we suffer from rapidly rising prices, which tell us that the money supply has been unwisely inflated. People are encouraged to borrow, increasing the money supply even more, and so a period of inflation tends to feed upon itself as well. Because of the government's unlimited power to borrow from the commercial banks, we now have over $2 trillion of national debt. In 1985 and 1986, prices were not rising as fast as they did in the 1970s. We were told over and over again that inflation was under control. But do not be misled by periods of slight price increases when the national debt is growing at a rate of over $200 billion per year. When the permanent money supply is outpacing production, prices will eventually catch up. The longer we go with $200 billion deficits, the greater the eventual price increases will be. This statement is backed up by the experiences of nations for more than 4,000 years. Let's review. The nation's commercial banks create our money supply by making loans. They do not lend your money, my money, the businessman's money, or money that belongs to anyone else. New money is created in the form of deposits for the borrower, whether it is a citizen, a business, or a government. All borrowers, except the federal government, must sooner or later repay the money that has been borrowed, unless they declare bankruptcy. When a loan is repaid to a commercial bank, or it has been absorbed in a bankruptcy, the assets and liabilities of the bank are reduced, and the money involved disappears from circulation. This distinction between the role of citizens and the role of their government is necessary in a dynamic economy. If production increases and the population grows, the money supply must also grow. Only the government can permanently increase the money supply to take care of growth. The government has a great fiscal responsibility. It must expand and contract the money supply through deficit spending and/or taxing just enough to maintain a vibrant economy without expanding or contracting it so greatly as to cause disturbing price increases and decreases with the resulting unemployment. Sometimes, when the private sector is borrowing and creating new money fast enough to keep the economy running, the government needs to slow down its own money creation. Sometimes, when the private sector is not creating enough new money to maintain a viable economy, the government needs to step in with new money to assist the nation's economy.